To build a culture of belief, you have to make learning louder than winning. Welcome, 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 everyone, to another episode of Finding Freedom Through Confidence. To if we haven't met us yet, I'm Tanique Easy, speaker, corporate trainer, facilitator, and empowerment coach. And I am also the creator of the MVP framework, Mindset, Vision, and Performance, where I help frontline and mid level leaders with mindset, vision, and performance strategies so they can lead, mentor, and coach their direct reports more effectively. As we move into this week's session, last week we talked about and we dug into the first habit that leaders need to create a team that thinks differently. And so last week we spoke about teaching your team and yourself how to use fear, and that is reframing fear into momentum. And so, as we talked about that, you all showed up and you showed out and you came out with some rich questions. You came out with some rich questions and comments. And, today we're going even deeper. We are going to talk about making learning louder than winning. And so before we get even further, I just want to pause and I want to welcome those who are joining live on LinkedIn, and welcome to my friend Leslie Flowers. Thank you so much for joining us from North Carolina. Thank you, Leslie, for being here with us. Each week, you're here with us, in the comments, in the chat, sharing and providing your own expertise and your own expounding on these topics. And we also want to also want to say thank you to those who are joining over there live on YouTube as well, sharing it out and bringing in other leaders like yourself. Because here is what here's what I have found as we talk about creating habits for leaders to create habits or create a team that thinks differently, is that you don't get a belief driven culture just by squashing fear. You actually get it by celebrating learning. So yes, fear is a real and present danger. Fear of, or the fear, or as I want to term it. So the fear that we spoke about last week, we spoke about several of them. The fear of failure, the fear of looking foolish. When you're in a meeting and you don't understand, but you don't want to ask the question, but because you don't want to look foolish. But when we ask those quote unquote foolish questions, they help to clarify for other persons. And so that brings us into the second habit that we want to dive into today, and that is to make learning louder than winning. Because the thing is, true motivation and prosperity comes when learning fuels purpose, not just when winning counts. And so let's talk about a silent killer. And this silent killer. So the problem with only celebrating win, the problem with only celebrating a win is that it is a silent killer, right? It is a silent killer of belief. That is the problem, and that's one of the main problems of only celebrating. It is a silent killer of belief. So let's talk about Jenny, right? Jenny is a new department head. She's a new department head of operations. She was promoted to that. Jenny is smart. She's talented. And she feels like her team is playing small. They don't offer, bold ideas. And when she asks them, or when she challenges them, they freeze up, and they don't take the initiative. And it's not because they are not brilliant people, But here's what's going on. Jenny, in her capacity, only praises her team when something is polished and perfect. And so she shared this frustration with her coach that every time I ask for bold ideas, every time I speak with my team, they freeze up, they don't take initiative. And when she shared that frustration with her coach, and there's a light bulb moment, there's like a light bulb moment that went off for Jenny, because in that moment, she realized what was happening. She was building a team that feared failure, not because she discouraged their creativity, but because she only celebrated the results. And so when persons fear failure, when they fear criticism, when they fear judgment, the motivation is not there. The creativity, even though it is within that context of the person, even though the team may have the creative, they may be creative geniuses, but when they fear failure, when they fear that they're going to be criticized or they're going to be judged based on what is coming out of their mouths, based on the ideas that they're putting forward, they don't say anything. They clam up, they shut up. And if you're seeing this in your organization, drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us know, because we're all here as a way to talk about these culture shifts that needs to happen. And so here's the insight. Here is the insight into that. When you only celebrate the finish line, you accidentally teach your team to hide the race. You accidentally teach your team to hide the effort. You teach them how to hide the false start. You teach them how to hide the learnings and the growth. Because if I'm only celebrating when I reach the finish line and I'm not celebrating the things that happens on the journey, then what is going to happen is that, my team will start to become disengaged. They're not going to show the initiative that I know that they can show, because we're only celebrating what's look perfect and what's look polished. We don't talk about the flaws. We don't talk about the effort that was put into reaching the finish line. We don't talk about the failed launches and what we learned from those failed launches. Like, you've launched something, you've launched a campaign and it didn't go as planned, but what did we learn? Because we don't talk about those things, because again, we're only celebrating the finish line. And so our team will only be in that space where they only think that only the finish line, only what crosses over the finish line is worth celebrating. But as we talk about this, I want to ask you, what are you really rewarding as a leader? If you are in operations, you're in HR, you're in, that segment of director level, and you are also as a part of the mid-level or the frontline leadership, what are you really celebrating? Are you celebrating what's lasting? What's the last thing? So I want to ask you these questions. What's the last thing your team celebrated? Was it a result or was it a risk? So did they just celebrate the finish line, or did you and your team celebrate the risk that was taken to launch a particular campaign, to launch a particular product, to share something, to catch something, a failed experiment? Did someone share a failed experiment, and were they pitied? Were they looked down on? Or were they, acknowledged that, hey, We are happy that you caught this failed experiment. And let's talk about what is it that you learned, or what is it that we can learn from this failed experiment. Or are you accidentally reinforcing perfectionism? Because when we reinforce perfectionism, people go into the fear of failure. People retreat into the fear of letting other people down. They retreat into that zone of, I am not going to say anything lest I look foolish, or I'm just going to do what is it that I can do. Because here's what this habit is doing. This habit is creating a culture where the process is just as visible as the outcome. When you're creating a culture of belief, when you're creating this culture where learning is louder than the winning, and we're not saying that you're not supposed to celebrate the winning, but when you celebrate the learning along the journey, you are creating a culture where the process is just as valuable as the outcome. Because you only when only flawlessness, when it's only flawless, when it's polished, it's perfect, when that alone is celebrated or gets recognized, here's what happened. Your people stop stretching. They stop decide they don't stretch anymore. They don't push out as much effort anymore. And so when that happens, they stop growing. And it's not because they don't want to grow, but it's because of the culture that is being shaped, that is being rewarded. That's why that happens. And so they stop growing. Welcome, welcome, Lisa. So happy to have you with us this morning. As always, great to see you. And so that's what happens. People stop growing, people stop stretching, people stop going above and beyond, because they realize that only when things are perfectly polished, then we get celebrated. We are not taught. We have not developed the habit, or our team has not developed the habit of celebrating the things that allowed us to get to the finish line, the perfectly polished. And so what does this mean? What it means to celebrate learning? What does this look like? Because celebrating only the wins is like applauding a plant. Let's look at it. If you applaud a plant for blooming, I mean, that's its job. That's the job of the flower. You have a flower, you have a mango tree, right? Lisa is in the Caribbean and she loves mangoes. Leslie, we want to invite you over to the Caribbean to have some nice, juicy mangoes. Some, we call them East Indian mangoes. I don't know what Lisa called them in her neck of the woods, but we have some mangoes, right? And you have a mango tree. The purpose of the mango tree is to produce mangoes. So are you going to applaud the mango tree when it starts producing mangoes? But you are ignoring the fact that the sun had something to do with the mango tree producing the fruit. Are you going to ignore the fact that rain fell, or even before the rain fell, you planted that tree and you had to water it? And that is a part of the process. Are you going to ignore the fact that you saw some branches that weren't looking so healthy and you had to prune it, you had to cut it off so that it could get to that state and that stage of producing those beautiful mangoes? So we are only applauding the mango tree. We go to the mango tree and we said, yes, you bear. But that's the purpose of the mango tree. And so here's what happens in the context of team dynamics is that belief doesn't grow in silence. It grows when people feel seen in the process. So when you and I feel seen, when we acknowledge, so as leaders, when we acknowledge our team members, when we acknowledge them in the process, not just at the finish line, but when we acknowledge them in the process, that's where belief starts to grow. Because there is a process, just like how there's a process to get the mango tree to a space of bearing, there is a process. And so when we make learning louder than just the winning, these are the things that will happen within our team dynamics. This is what we will start seeing. This is what will start. This is how the belief will start to bloom and to blossom even more. It's that risk becomes normal. We start taking a risk, calculated risk that we know, even if it is not 100%, we get to learn from it. We get to take calculated risk that will help us to stretch our imagination as we move into innovation becomes safe, because without imagination we cannot innovate, and because we're not taking risk, our imagination is not stretching and innovation becomes a stagnant. But when we take a risk, when we are learning in the process and we're taking those calculated risks, then our imagination, our creativity stretches, and our confidence in self, our confidence, our belief starts to grow. And then that belief becomes contagious, because we are doing this together. We are not isolated. We are not only celebrating when we cross the finish line. And so here are some companies that continues or has taken on, I should say, they have taken on this, where they celebrate failure. They celebrate failure, not just the wins. They give their teams a permission to fail so that they can learn to improve what is already there, or learn to improve what they are going to be doing. And so when we think about Google is one of those companies that they explicitly rewards failure. They had this project called Google Wave, and it didn't succeed. So they took on this project called Google Wave. It didn't succeed, but what that did was that it fostered a culture of experimentation within that team. And so they celebrated the rewards of failure. They celebrated that. They took that on, and they have what they call like a failure week, or a failure of the week. What didn't go well? What didn't go right? Another company that, as I did deeper research, was Intuit. Intuit hosts, what they do, they host failure parties. They host failure parties, and they award the team best failure trophy, signaling that thoughtful risk, even if it doesn't succeed, is celebrated. And that is where a culture of belief starts to take shape. That's how we create teams that think differently. That's how we create an environment where people are not afraid of failure. They're not afraid of the criticism. They're not afraid of the judgment. They're not afraid of letting people down. But what they do, because they have created this culture where failure is celebrated, failure is recognized. And I know many times we use failure as a stepping stone, but it is often applied outside of a corporate environment. When you are in entrepreneurship, use failure as a stepping stone. Or when you're doing something else, use failure as a stepping stone in your own personal journey. But when we bring this kind of culture into organizations, when we create this culture in organization where we make learning louder than the winning, we are creating a safe space. We're creating a space where people feel psychologically safe. And we spoke about that last week, where people feel psychologically safe to fail, where they feel psychologically safe that they can talk about the the things that didn't go well, and they're not bashed, or they're not criticized, or they're not judged. And so if we even want to take it a step further, Pixar, like we know all of those the movies, we know those things. Pixar, they had a near catastrophic loss on Toy Story 2. And that was a major learning curve for them. But here's what happened. As they had that almost catastrophic, loss, what they did, they debriefed non-judgmentally. Again, they created a culture, a space, a psychologically safe space, a culture where people do not fear criticism, where people do not fear failure, where they do not fear looking foolish. They created that space. And because they are celebrating the learning along the process, they were able to debrief without judgment, and they shared the lessons that they learned openly. And so this becomes a value within that company. This became a value ladder within that space and context. Because again, it's not just the act of winning, but it's the act of learning. What are we learning? So how do we anchor this mindset shift? Because it's a mindset shift. It takes a mindset shift. It is a mindset shift that is required to adopt this kind of culture, to create this kind of culture. A culture of belief, not just a culture of winning, but developing a culture of belief in self, a culture of belief in, I have this idea and I'm going to share it. But here's what Ariana, Huffington says, and I believe it will help us. I really believe as leaders that when we take apart this quote and we look at it and we apply it into our organizations, we're going to see retention. We're going to see where people start staying even longer with us as companies, because we are building this culture of belief. And that culture of belief, that culture where they're not fearing the failure, they're not fearing the criticism, they're not fearing the judgment, but they have a psychologically safe space, right? They are going to stay longer. They're going to feel like, hey, I can do something great in this company. So what Ariana Huffington says is that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the tuition you pay to grow. But how many of us don't want to pay that tuition? We want to reach to the success, but we don't want to pay the tuition. It's like you're saying, well, I am going to get a master's degree, but I'm not going to pay any tuition to get it. So even if you get a scholarship, a full scholarship, someone has to pay. But you may not pay financially, but you are paying with your time. And so failure isn't the opposite of success. So it's not on one side and the other one is on one side. They work together. It's like going together. And so let's pair that with this truth that if your people aren't trying. If your people aren't trying, they are all, and if they're already trying things that they know, right? So if your people are only trying things that they know that they'll win at, your culture isn't courageous, it's careful. So examine your culture at this time. I want you to pause as you reflect and as you listen, as you watch the replay of this. So whether you're watching live or you're watching the replay of this, think about, is my culture a courageous culture or is it a careful culture? What's the culture that I'm building here? Can I be the one to turn this culture around? Because here's what this habit says, it says that we don't just praise performance, we praise progression. That's what the habit of making learning louder than winning, celebrating learning louder than winning, make learning louder than the winning. That's what you're praising. You're praising not just the performance, because the performance is excellence, because the performance is what will help you to keep the doors of the business open. But also, the progression is also a part of that process, a part of that performance. So, how do we make learning louder than winning? How do we make that louder than winning? Here's how we can bring this to life. This week, today, we still have 24 hours tomorrow and part of today. So we have about 72, well, 24, 36. We have about 36 hours or a little bit more to start this. We can start implementing it today. So you are listening. Thank you so much for joining us live. You're watching the replay, type hashtag replay in the comments and let us know, again, let us know what were your takeaways from this? How are you going to create a culture that celebrates learning louder than the winning? And so here's how this is going to work. Here's how we can make this work this week in your team, in your life, is to create practices that normalize risk. What does that look like? You want to have a learning spotlight in your team meeting. So if you're having a team meeting today, you're having a team meeting because some companies, they do have a team meeting on a Friday to talk about what happened for that week. And so this now becomes part of your end of week reflection. And you're asking your team, what didn't work this week? What didn't work so well? What did we learn? And encourage persons to speak up, encourage persons to believe in what they are sharing. Because these habits that we are creating is going to help the team to stay even longer. They're going to help us to win even more. At the end of the day, your bottom line, you will see improvement in your sales outcome. You will see improvement in your operation efficiency because we are making learning louder than the winning. We are highlighting the learning within the team context, within the team meeting. And we're now making it a part of our weekly reflection. And so reward insight, not just outcome. So that's the second thing that you can do. So you can take one of the three or all three, but reward insight, not just outcome. So how do we live this practically? Did someone surface a challenge early? Did someone unearth a challenge did they unearth a challenge early within the process? If they did, celebrate that, celebrate them, celebrate that. Let the team know that this is what happened and this person caught this challenge before we got to the midpoint. Or did someone try a new approach? Did one of your team members try a new approach? Even if it didn't work out according to the plan. But what you want to do is to ask them to share what they tried next. What did you try next? You tried this approach, it didn't work. what was the next step? What did you learn? What was the next step? And then the final thing to making learning practically louder than winning is that you want to model it yourself. As leaders, we want to model this culture. We want to model this belief. We want to model this habit of making learning louder than winning. And so as a leader, don't just talk about what you have achieved. Yes, we like the applauses. We like when people, talk about us. But here's what will help your team. Here's what will help our teams to grow and to develop that sense of belief. Is that when you talk about what you have learned during your failed attempts, let them know that you tried, you were in this position and you tried before you became a department head, before you became the leader of the team. These are some of the things you've tried and they didn't work out, or they didn't work out, as well. But these are the lessons that I have garnered along the way. And this is how we can move forward. So it's not just about me. It's not just about the winning, but it's about asking yourself, how can I model this for my team? How can I model this for my team? Ask them, share with them. I was someone who didn't like to ask for help, but I reached out because when I realized that the project was going sideways, I had to ask for help. And so you model this kind of habit, and your team will know, put themselves in that space and that position to start stretching, to start being more innovative, to start being more creative, to allow their innate creativity, because we're all creative, we're all innovative. But because the fear of failure, again, the fear of criticism, the fear of judgment, those stifle our creativity. But when we take away when we take away the power from fear of failure, the power from fear of criticism, we take away the power of fear of judgment, we take away that power and we allow ourselves to model this habit of making learning louder than winning, our teams will do the same, and we will start seeing the innate creativity coming out. And so tell this to your team. I want you to share this with your team. Share this kind of experience with your team. Share this exact statement with your team. I don't expect perfection. I expect evolution. And keep on saying it to them. Keep on sharing it with them. Every time you have a team meeting and they are not speaking up, you see the fear on their faces. And that is also self-awareness. When you are able to see and to read your team members, that's emotional intelligence at work. And you bring them to a space and said, I don't expect perfection, but I expect evolution. I expect that we're going to be evolving every time. The process is not going to be perfect. We are going to have some ups and we're going to have some downs. But as we go and as we grow together on this journey as leader and as team members, what my expectation is that we're going to evolve. And so as we wrap up, what does this habit look like in action? I want us to, we talk about as a team leader, but what does it look like in action? What are some of the action items? So to build a culture of belief, here are some of the things that as leaders, I encourage us to do. is to shift the focus from being right to growing wiser. Shift the focus from being right to growing wiser. What does that mean? Well, it's not about being right. It's about being, okay, um, how can we experiment and grow and become better? So it's not, you have to be right. It's about growing wiser. And it goes back to, I don't expect perfection, I expect evolution. So we tie that into how we put this habit into action. How does this look like in action again? The second thing is that you normalize the struggle that comes with real innovation, because there are real struggles. There are real struggles that's going to happen. There are real struggles that are happening when innovation comes about. It's not going to just come and it's just going to be perfect. When we are creating something that is outside of the norm, that is outside of the box, because we are thinking outside of the box, we're going to have struggles, we're going to have challenges. But let's normalize that. Let's allow people to feel like they are growing. And then the third and final way to put this, how does this habit look in action, is to make learning visible, loud, and valuable. We spoke about Google, we spoke about Intuit, right? We spoke about Pixar. Those are companies that recognize failure, actively recognize failure. And so what they do, they make it visible, they make it loud, and they make it valuable. They don't shame people. They don't shame people. And I want to highlight Thomas Watson Sr. He is the former IBM CEO. And he had given, when a sales rep had failed a big deal, here's what Watson did. He offered that sales rep to explain. He offered him a chance to explain what went wrong. I invested in your education. I invested in you. I invested in you, and I want to know what happened. But he didn't do it in a place of guilt. He allowed him to share. He allowed him to make the learning visible. And he made the failure a trusted growth moment. And so it was valuable both for Thomas Watson as well as the entire team, along with the sales rep. So it's not about guilting people, guilt tripping your team into, oh, you didn't do this right. You didn't do this right. And this is how I would have done it. So we don't guilt trip people in those ways, but we allow them to explain, and we show it, we make it visible. We ask the team to come and together and allow the persons to explain what did they learn and what you can learn from it as well. And so growth isn't always shiny. Here's the thing, growth isn't always shiny, but it is sacred. And I believe, one of the things I believe, if Dr. Marcia was on with us today, she would say that, and she would urge leaders also, because she's a leadership coach, right? She would encourage leaders to redefine team prosperity, because this is what this is all about: making learning louder than winning. It's about the team motivation, the team prosperity, bringing the team together. And so what she would say is to redefine team prosperity, not as hitting the quarterly targets, but as growing together in trust, in skill, and belief. Because here's the thing, leaders, when we choose to make learning louder than winning, we unlock the internal, not just the external, but we unlock the true internal motivation for our team members. And so here are some reflection questions. I know I've asked you a lot of questions, I've asked you to reflect it a lot, but that is the point of this, because we're shifting our mindset. And it doesn't come overnight, it's going to take practice. And so here are some reflection questions that I want to leave with you. Is that, what is one way you could celebrate learning this week on your team? Sit and reflect and ask yourself that. Or ask yourself, when was the last time I praised someone for taking a smart risk, even if it didn't go perfectly? Or you can ask yourself, what habit can I create that normalizes growth? As a leader, what habit can I create that normalizes growth? And so I want you to drop your answers in the comments, or drop them in the chat. And if today's habit helped you to rethink how you lead, I want you to go ahead and to hit the like and subscribe button. And share this, repost it, share it with other leaders who you like, who you trust, who you know needs to hear this. Share it with them. And continue to subscribe, because each week we're here for weekly leadership conversation. And again, the Leadership Growth Tour is open for applications. You can DM me to book a call. The link to my calendar will be in the show notes, so you can book your call directly there with me. And let's talk about how we can bring this Leadership Growth Tour to your team, because it's not another motivational talk. It is going to be an active workshop where we're going to be dealing with mindset. So we're going to deal with the mindset aspect of the MVP framework, built on belief, flexibility, and focus. And we have been dealing with belief. How do we create a culture of belief? How do we create a culture where our employees, where our direct reports, where our team thinks differently? Again, thank you for joining me for another episode on Finding Freedom Through Confidence. Thank you for joining live. If you're watching the replay, type #replay and share your comments again in the chat. And because I read all of them and I respond to all of them. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of the week, and go out and engage in one of these habits that I shared with you today. Bye for now.